Picture the scene. You're descending a narrow spiral of worn stone steps, one hand brushing a wall slick with cold moisture. The torch in your other hand throws shadows that seem to move on their own. With each step down, the air grows thicker, heavier, tasting of iron and old smoke. Somewhere far above you, a bell tolls the hour, but down here, time no longer belongs to the living. At the bottom of the staircase, a low wooden door groans open. The room beyond is smaller than you imagined. Not a vast chamber of horrors, just a workshop. A single beam runs across the ceiling. A rope hangs from it. In the corner, a small table holds a candle, an inkwell, and a leather-bound ledger. A man in a dark coat sits behind it, sharpening a quill. He does not look up when you enter. He is waiting for someone else. Someone who will be dragged down these same steps within the hour. Someone whose screams will be transcribed into that ledger in careful, patient handwriting. Because that is what this room is for. Not vengeance. Not entertainment. Paperwork. This was a real torture chamber. And what you are about to learn will overturn almost everything Hollywood, museums, and history books have told you about what actually happened behind these doors. Let's uncover the dark truth. The real torture chamber was something far more disturbing because it was ordinary. Most were small, cramped, practical. A single room in the basement of a town hall or courthouse, no larger than a modest kitchen. There was a beam, a table, a chair, and a chest of tools. That was often the entire inventory. The men who worked inside these rooms treated their equipment the way a carpenter treats his workshop. Everything cleaned, everything oiled, everything logged. And here's the first shock. Torture, in a late medieval and early modern world, was not lawless brutality. It was a legal procedure. There were rule books. There were time limits. There were categories of pain, ranked from mild to severe, that a judge had to approve in writing before the interrogator could proceed to the next level. In many territories, a physician was required to be present, not to relieve suffering, but to certify that the accused was strong enough to survive it. Think about that for a moment. The man crushing your thumbs had a license. The man screaming above you had signed a document consenting to be there, even if that consent was extracted at knife point. The chamber was not a place outside the law. It was the law, distilled into its most terrifying form. The horror was that they were modern and methodical. Now picture yourself lying flat on a heavy wooden frame. Your wrists are bound to a roller at the top. Your ankles are bound to a roller at the bottom. A wheel turns. The ropes tighten. Your body begins to stretch, slowly, patiently, one notch at a time. This was the rack. And unlike most of what you have seen in books and museums, the rack was absolutely, undeniably real. Used across much of Europe for centuries, it was the workhorse of the torture chamber. The genius of the device, if you can call it that, lay in its precision. The interrogator could stop at any moment. He could tighten by fractions. He could offer relief in exchange for words. It was designed not to kill, but to break the will slowly enough that the mind gave up before the body did. Victims often survived the rack, at least in the immediate sense. But the aftermath was its own quiet horror. Shoulders and hips could be permanently dislocated. Tendons tore. Some accused men and women left the chamber unable to walk without assistance for the rest of their lives. Human ruins wearing the outward shape of the people they used to be. Here is the darker truth beneath the pain. The rack was not really about extracting information. It was about extracting confession. And confession was the queen of proofs in early modern law. Without a confession, many cases could not be closed. With a confession, no matter how it was obtained, the machinery of the court could grind forward to its verdict. So the rack did what it was built to do. It manufactured truth. Whether the truth was actually true was, in the end, a question no one in that chamber was allowed to ask. Now think about the most recognizable torture device in the world. A tall iron cabinet shaped like a coffin, its inside lined with long spikes, ready to close around a victim in a final, murderous embrace. You have seen it in films. You have seen it in dungeon museums across Europe. You may have paid a ticket to gasp at one in person. Here is the twist that changes everything. The Iron Maiden almost certainly never existed as a real torture device. There is no credible medieval record of it. No trial mentions it. No executioner's manual describes it. No skeleton has ever been recovered from inside one. The famous example that made the device world famous was displayed in a German town in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it was almost certainly assembled from unrelated older parts long after the age of torture had ended. When scholars finally examined it seriously, the illusion collapsed. The Iron Maiden was a museum exhibit pretending to be a memory. A prop dressed as history. So why do we all know it? Because a spiked iron coffin sells more tickets than an honest plaque. In the 1800s, as tourism boomed across Europe, castles and old town halls competed for visitors. Dungeon exhibits became attractions. Curators and showmen quietly invented, embellished, and fabricated devices to fill the empty rooms of decommissioned prisons. The public wanted horror. The market delivered. This is the strange lesson buried inside the Iron Maiden. The medieval world was cruel enough on its own. But it was not cruel in the specific theatrical, cinematic ways we now believe. We built those images ourselves, centuries later, and then blamed our ancestors for our own imagination. Look up at that single beam in the ceiling. That rope hanging quietly from it. That is not decoration. That is the strappado, and it was perhaps the most widely used torture technique in all of early modern Europe. The mechanism was brutal in its simplicity. The victim's hands were tied behind their back. The rope was then attached to the wrists and thrown over the beam. The interrogator pulled. The body rose from the floor, arms wrenched violently backward and upward, the full weight of the person hanging from joints never meant to bear it. Within minutes, the shoulders would dislocate. Sometimes the interrogator added stone weights to the feet, deepening the damage. Sometimes he would let the victim drop suddenly, then stop the fall just before the ground, so the body snapped taut in midair. That variation had its own grim name, and it could destroy a human being's arms in seconds. Why was the strappado so common? Because it required almost nothing. No expensive machine. No specialist device. Just a rope and a beam. Any town, no matter how small, could conduct an interrogation. That accessibility is what made it a favorite of secular and religious courts alike. But here is the deeper insight. The most terrifying tools of the torture chamber were never the elaborate iron contraptions of legend. They were the humblest objects reimagined for cruelty. A rope. A screw. A weight. A chair. The chamber's true horror was that any ordinary object, in the right hands, could be turned into an instrument of confession. Evil does not always arrive dressed in spikes. Sometimes it arrives with a piece of hemp cord and a nod from the man behind the ledger. Now, shift your attention from the tools to the man who used them. Picture him leaving the chamber at the end of the day, wiping his hands, closing the ledger, climbing those spiral stairs back into the world of the living. Where does he go? Who welcomes him home? Almost no one. The executioner and torturer of early modern Europe was one of the most feared and despised figures in society, and also one of the most dependent on official protection. His trade was hereditary in many regions, passed from father to son, because respectable families refused to marry into his line. His children could not enter most guilds. He was often forbidden from sitting inside taverns, forced to drink from his own cup at his own table by the door. And yet, this same outcast was a professional. A specialist. In some cities, he was trained in anatomy because his work required detailed knowledge of joints, muscles, and pain thresholds. Many executioners doubled as informal healers, setting bones and stitching wounds for the poor who could not afford physician. The very hands that broke bodies in the chamber mended bodies in the alleys. Think about the psychological weight of that life. He walked between two worlds. The state needed him. The public loathed him. The church distrusted him. He served justice as it was defined by the law, and paid for it with a lifetime of quiet exile. Here is the power line worth remembering. Every society that authorizes cruelty also needs someone to perform it, and then punishes that someone for saying yes. The executioner was the shadow the law refused to look at, even as it depended on him to exist. He was proof that the chamber's true damage never stayed inside the chamber. It leaked into families, into bloodlines, into the memory of towns for generations. Return for a moment to the museum. Walk past the glass cases. Notice how many devices are labeled with confident descriptions of their supposed purpose. Now understand this. A surprisingly large number of them are wrong. The infamous spiked chair, bristling with iron points, meant to slowly impale its occupant. Real chairs like it did exist, but they were far rarer and less standardized than displays suggest, and many surviving examples are later reconstructions. The pear-shaped metal device, said to be forced into mouths or worse, and cranked open from the inside. Historians and metallurgists have shown that most surviving examples date from centuries after the medieval period, and the mechanisms are often too fragile to have functioned as advertised. It may have been more legend than practice. Even the wheel, that vast circular platform on which condemned prisoners were broken and displayed, has been softened and warped by centuries of retelling. It was real, and it was horrifying, but the specific rituals varied wildly by region, and much of what tourists learn today is a 19th century mashup rather than an accurate reconstruction. Why does so much of the myth outshine the reality? Because the truth is harder to display behind glass. The truth is a small room, a rope, a ledger, and a man with a license. There is nothing to photograph. There is no dramatic silhouette. There is only bureaucracy, and bureaucracy does not sell postcards. This is perhaps the most unsettling revelation of all. The torture chamber has been mythologized precisely because its real workings were too quiet, too paperwork-bound, too disturbingly modern to satisfy our appetite for Gothic horror. So we invented spiked coffins and grinning masks. And in doing so, we let the real machinery slip out of memory. The lie was louder than the fact. It usually is. So what ended it? What finally emptied these rooms, closed these doors, and turned the ledgers to dust? Not one thing. Not one hero. A slow, uneven turning of a human mind spread across generations. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a growing chorus of jurists, doctors, and philosophers began to argue what should have been obvious from the start. That torture did not produce truth. That any human being, given enough pain, would confess to anything. That the confessions extracted in these chambers were not evidence. They were echoes of the interrogator's own questions, shouted back through a broken throat. One by one, European states began to abolish judicial torture. Some reforms came from monarchs. Some came from parliaments. Some came only after scandalous cases in which clearly innocent people had been destroyed by the chamber, their names cleared only after their deaths. By the dawn of the modern age, the ledgers stopped being written. The beams were removed. The chambers were locked, forgotten, and eventually opened again as museums. But here is the sober truth. The chambers did not close because humans stopped being cruel. They closed because a specific legal theory, that pain produces truth, finally collapsed under the weight of its own failures. Cruelty itself did not die. It simply had to find new addresses. That is why the memory of these rooms matters. They are not a story about a barbaric past that has nothing to do with us. They are a warning about what happens whenever a society decides that a confession, obtained by any means, is worth more than the truth. Step back now, out of the chamber, up the spiral stair into the light, and ask yourself the question every honest history eventually asks. Why should any of this matter to you? Centuries later, in a world of laptops and airports and streaming services. Because the machinery of the torture chamber was not built by monsters. It was built by ordinary men doing paperwork. Judges who believed in order. Clerks who believed in procedure. Interrogators who believed they were craftsmen. Priests who believed the soul mattered more than the body. Every person in that system could go home at night and tell themselves they were serving something greater than their own hands. That is the deepest lesson these dark rooms leave us. Cruelty at scale almost never announces itself as cruelty. It arrives wearing the uniform of law, or faith, or public safety, or necessity. It arrives with forms to sign and rules to follow. It arrives so calmly that the people inside it stop seeing it at all. Modern societies do not use racks and strapatos. But every time a state decides that certain human beings deserve less protection than others, every time a confession under pressure is treated as the end of a question rather than the beginning of one, every time we accept that a locked room somewhere is quietly doing the ugly work no one wants to name, we are echoing the logic of those old chambers. Different tools. Same temptation. The past is not a foreign country. It is a mirror we would rather not look into. And the torture chamber, small and stone-cold and bureaucratic, holds up one of the clearest reflections history has ever offered. It shows us that the greatest atrocities are usually committed not by the monstrous, but by the methodical. That is why we still need to remember it. Not to shudder, but to recognize the pattern wherever it begins to rise again. So let us gather what we have uncovered. The real torture chambers of the medieval and early modern world were not cavernous halls of grinning horror. They were small, orderly, licensed rooms in the basements of ordinary buildings. The tools that truly ruled inside them were not the spiked coffins of legend, but simple ropes, screws, and wooden frames. The most famous devices in every dungeon museum are, in many cases, later inventions, dressed up to satisfy an audience hungry for Gothic terror. The lesson here is twofold. First, always be suspicious of history that flatters our appetite for drama, because myth is almost always louder than fact. Second, never underestimate the quieter, more bureaucratic forms of cruelty, because those are the ones that actually shape the world, and those are the ones most likely to return in new disguises. If this journey into the real dungeon shook something loose in a way you see the past, do not let it end here. Subscribe to Medieval Secrets Unlocked. Ring the bell so you never miss the next revelation, and dive into our other investigations that strip the costume off history and show you what was really underneath. And before you go, tell me this in the comments. Which torture device or dungeon legend did you always believe was completely real until today? I read every answer, and the best ones often become the seeds of future videos. Because in the end, the truth about the past is often stranger than the myth. A brief closing word. This video is offered as historical education,